I never thought returning home early would feel like walking into a trap. The moment I pulled into my driveway, I saw her, my neighbor, the self-appointed queen of our HOA, standing there with a smug, triumphant smile as if she owned the entire street. My front gate, my property, suddenly felt like enemy territory. 2 weeks she'd been living in my house while I was away, and somehow the HOA was on her side. I froze, heart racing, wondering how far she would go, and then I saw her pull out her phone. Would she call the cops? Or was this just the beginning of something far worse?
Life in our quiet suburban community had always felt safe, predictable, almost idyllic. I had moved into my mansion 5 years ago, drawn by the tree-lined streets, manicured lawns, and neighbors who nodded politely when you passed them. Weekends were spent tending to my garden, enjoying coffee on the veranda, or hosting small, casual gatherings with close friends. My family and I had built routines, little pockets of peace in our bustling lives where everything seemed under control.
I prided myself on being a respectful neighbor. Trash bins were never left out past collection day, hedges were trimmed, and the mailbox always gleamed. Yet, behind the friendly facades of our homeowners association meetings and polite waves, a subtle tension simmered, an invisible web of petty rules, complaints, and unwritten hierarchies that no one talked about. I had glimpsed it before, a whispered warning about lawn decorations, a note about the paint color of a neighbor's shutters, vague references to HOA fines. It all felt distant, almost trivial, until one day that invisible tension landed squarely in my driveway.
I didn't know it yet, but the neighbor who had always seemed helpful and slightly overbearing, checking in too often, offering advice I hadn't asked for, was about to test every limit of civility and patience. The HOA itself, the organization we trusted to keep peace, was quietly waiting in the wings, ready to wield their authority in ways I could never have imagined. And that 2-week absence I had taken for a family trip, it would be the spark that lit the fuse of one of the most absurd, infuriating, and emotionally exhausting battles of my life. Returning home should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like stepping into a war zone disguised as my own driveway. The moment I crossed the threshold, I noticed the first warning signs, brightly colored notices pinned to my gate, official-looking envelopes shoved through the mail slot, and sticky notes with angry scribbles attached to my front door. My heart sunk as I realized this wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was a full-blown assault from the HOA, and more specifically, from the neighbor who had been watching over my house like a hawk while I was away. The first letter detailed a violation I couldn't even comprehend: improper property use and unauthorized occupancy during absence. Apparently, allowing my family to be away for 2 weeks qualified as a crime in this hyper-regulated community. The notice demanded a meeting with the HOA within 48 hours, or fines would begin accruing daily. I tried to reason with myself, thinking this must be some clerical error. But then I saw her, standing at the edge of the driveway with a victorious smirk, phone in hand, as though documenting every detail for the HOA's inspection committee.
Over the next few days, the tension escalated faster than I could respond. She began showing up at odd hours, ostensibly checking in, but it was clear her real goal was intimidation. The HOA seemed to tacitly encourage her behavior, citing community oversight responsibilities. Every complaint she filed was met with immediate fines, warnings, or vague threats of legal action. A single potted plant left in the wrong spot earned a $150 fine. Leaving my garage slightly ajar resulted in a formal letter stating I had violated security and aesthetic codes. It became clear that no aspect of normal life in my home was safe from scrutiny. My attempts to push back were met with bureaucratic stonewalls. Emails went unanswered, phone calls redirected, and the HOA board meetings felt like carefully staged ambushes. I remember walking into one meeting, hoping to present my side calmly, only to be interrupted mid-sentence. The board members nodded politely while reading off a list of complaints my neighbor had submitted. The front gate was open for 2 minutes longer than allowed. Garden ornaments are not aligned according to approved aesthetic specifications. Each rule sounded more absurd than the last, yet the fines and threats were real and mounting.
Meanwhile, the community, which had once felt welcoming, began taking sides. Casual greetings became cold nods. Whispers followed me wherever I went. Some neighbors openly sympathized but were unwilling to risk retaliation, while others seemed to take pleasure in the chaos, treating it like some sort of spectator sport. Even mundane tasks, watering plants, receiving deliveries, parking my own car, felt laden with risk. Every move was scrutinized, every decision potentially punishable. Then came the surveillance. Cameras appeared mysteriously, focused on my driveway and front door. Motion sensors that I never installed began recording my comings and goings. When I asked the HOA about them, the answers were vague and unhelpful. For community security, they claimed, but it was obvious the real purpose was monitoring my behavior. Privacy became a concept I could no longer grasp. Even inside my own home, I felt exposed. The situation intensified when my neighbor began filing complaints about noise levels. Friends visiting for casual conversations or short gatherings were suddenly framed as violations of community tranquility ordinances. One afternoon, a simple family barbecue was interrupted by a formal notice warning that unpermitted social activity could result in further fines and legal action. I was trapped in a system designed to punish any deviation from an invisible, absurd set of rules, enforced by someone who seemed to take personal satisfaction in seeing me suffer.
At night, my mind raced with what-ifs. What if the fines escalated beyond what I could pay? What if the HOA pursued legal action that could drain years of savings? I tried documenting everything, photographing notices, recording encounters, and emailing detailed accounts to the board. But the more evidence I provided, the more they seemed to twist it into justification for additional fines. It became a psychological chess game. Each move I made was anticipated, countered, and used against me. Then came the threats disguised as advice. My neighbor suggested I consider selling quickly before things get worse, implying that the community could make life unbearable. Letters from the HOA arrived with increasing frequency, some typed in official letterhead, others scribbled with menacing urgency. Every day brought a new challenge: fines for landscaping non-compliance, citations for improper driveway use, and accusations that I had altered my property without approval. The harassment had reached a peak fever. And yet, amidst the chaos, I refused to back down. Each encounter fueled a mix of anger and determination. I began to research HOA rules, local ordinances, and legal loopholes that might give me leverage. Late nights were spent drafting responses and compiling evidence, trying to fight back against what felt like an endless tide of petty tyranny. Every small victory, a fine rescinded, a complaint dismissed, was celebrated quietly, but I knew the real confrontation was still ahead. Just when I thought the situation couldn't get worse, a new letter arrived, different from the others. This one wasn't just a fine or warning. It was a formal notice of unauthorized residency during my absence, implying criminal implications. My neighbor had escalated her game, and the HOA had backed her fully. My pulse quickened as I read it, realizing that this battle was no longer about trivial complaints. It was about control, intimidation, and exposing the absurdity of the system in front of the entire community.
By the time the third week rolled around, the situation had escalated into something unrecognizable. My home, once a sanctuary, had become a stage for the most absurd and infuriating power struggle I had ever experienced. Every morning I awoke with a sense of dread, wondering which new violation the HOA would invent, what petty attack my neighbor had orchestrated overnight, or which arbitrary rule would be weaponized against me next. The constant barrage of notices, fines, and thinly veiled threats had pushed me to the edge, but I had reached a point where I could no longer remain passive. Something had to give. It started that Friday morning when I returned from a brief errand to find my driveway blocked. My neighbor's SUV was parked squarely in front of my gate, tires angled like a barricade. On the windshield was a note: HOA-approved surveillance in progress. Unauthorized entry prohibited. She stood at the edge of the property, arms crossed, smirking as if daring me to challenge her. Normally, I might have sought a quiet solution, but the weeks of intimidation had honed a simmering determination that I could no longer contain. I took a deep breath, raised my camera to document the obstruction, and stepped forward. The confrontation was instantaneous. She accused me of violating community codes by interfering with HOA-approved observation, as though any attempt to reclaim my property was itself a punishable offense. I pointed out the absurdity: my own driveway, my own home. But the HOA rules, as interpreted by her, seemed designed to strip every ounce of common sense from the situation. Voices rose. Her phone stayed out, recording everything with a calculated precision, while the neighbors began to gather, whispering, some in fascination, others in thinly veiled judgment. Then came the notice that would ignite the climax: a formal citation threatening legal action for trespassing and interference with community-sanctioned residence oversight. I stared at the official letterhead, incredulous. For 2 weeks she had been living inside my house while I was absent, and somehow she was the victim in the HOA's eyes? My pulse raced, anger mixing with disbelief. I could feel the collective energy of the gathered neighbors, some rooting for her, some silently wishing they could intervene, all witnessing a spectacle that was part farce, part injustice. But I had prepared. For days I had been quietly gathering evidence: photos, timestamps, records of all HOA communications, videos documenting her daily comings and goings inside my property. Every warning, every fine, every harassment notice was meticulously logged. And now, standing in my driveway, facing the person who had turned my life upside down, I unleashed the truth. I pulled out the evidence, showing her in her own handwriting admitting to occupying the property, videos of her moving freely through my house, and timestamps proving my absence. The crowd leaned in, sensing a tide turning. The HOA, which had previously seemed untouchable, could no longer ignore the mountain of proof. Emails were exchanged mid-confrontation, board members whispering among themselves, their faces betraying panic and discomfort. For the first time, the narrative she had carefully crafted, me as the violator, her as the vigilant community guardian, crumbled visibly in front of the neighbors. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the small audience that had assembled. She reacted with anger, yelling accusations, insisting that her actions were justified under some obscure clause about community oversight in temporary absences. But the more she tried to explain, the more the evidence contradicted her, exposing each lie, each manipulation, each petty abuse of power. By now, the emotion in the air was palpable: frustration, relief, incredulity. I could almost feel the tension breaking like a coiled spring, ready to snap in my favor. Then, in a final escalation, she made the mistake of calling the police, certainly expecting them to side with her, given the HOA's influence. I remained calm, showing them the evidence I had painstakingly collected. They took statements, reviewed the documentation, and left without a word, leaving her visibly flustered. For the first time, the invincibility she had projected was gone. She could no longer manipulate the law or the HOA's authority to her advantage. The rules she had wielded like weapons had become a cage for her own arrogance. But the ultimate twist came when I presented the HOA with a formal complaint of harassment, unlawful occupation, and intentional disruption of property rights. The board, previously so rigid and intimidating, had no choice but to acknowledge the violations. They began issuing formal notices reversing fines, mandating restitution, and warning her that any further interference could result in legal consequences. The community watched, riveted, as the balance of power shifted. The very organization she had used to torment me became the instrument of her exposure.
Throughout this ordeal, I felt a surge of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also exhaustion. Weeks of harassment, sleepless nights, and emotional strain had culminated in this single moment where truth and preparation overcame manipulation and power abuse. Yet, even as I felt a sense of triumph, I knew the resolution was only beginning. The aftermath of such public exposure would ripple through the community, changing dynamics, relationships, and reputations in ways no one could ignore. The day after the confrontation, an almost surreal quiet settled over the neighborhood. It was as though the invisible tension that had dominated the past weeks had been lifted, leaving a space that felt strangely empty yet peaceful. The constant barrage of notices, the surveillance, the petty fines, and the harassing neighbor all had vanished from my daily life. But the experience had left an indelible mark, not just on my sense of security, but on my understanding of what it truly meant to protect one's home, dignity, and peace of mind. Immediately, the HOA began implementing the first steps toward restitution. Fines that had been levied against me for absurd violations, ranging from minor landscaping discrepancies to imaginary occupancy issues, were rescinded. Official apologies arrived, written in formal language yet heavy with acknowledgement of their misjudgment. It was a rare moment of bureaucratic humility, and while it didn't erase the stress and sleepless nights I had endured, it offered a measure of validation that the truth could not be ignored. My neighbor, the orchestrator of so much chaos, faced consequences too. The HOA issued warnings that any further harassment or interference could result in legal action, including charges for unlawful occupancy and intentional disruption of property rights. The once smug, invincible figure had retreated into the shadows, and whispers about her behavior spread quietly through the community. Some neighbors expressed surprise that the system had actually held her accountable, while others reflected on how easily they had been swayed by appearances before witnessing the full scope of the conflict. Life in the neighborhood slowly began to return to its rhythm. I reinstated routines that had been disrupted, the morning walks along familiar tree-lined streets, gardening without fear of scrutiny, hosting small gatherings with friends and family. Each activity felt reclaimed, but also imbued with a cautious awareness of how fragile civility could be in a community structured around seemingly reasonable rules that, when misapplied, could become instruments of control.
The experience also altered my relationship with the community. I had once relied on polite nods and casual smiles as measures of harmony, but now I understood that true peace required vigilance. Some neighbors expressed apologies, admitting they had witnessed the harassment and chosen silence over intervention. Others shared their own subtle conflicts with the HOA, revealing that the pettiness and overreach I had endured were not isolated incidents. Slowly, conversation shifted from gossip to awareness, from judgment to discussion of how the community could better enforce fairness and accountability. On a personal level, the ordeal left me stronger, more resilient, and more capable of confronting authority when it becomes arbitrary or abusive. I had learned the importance of documentation, patience, and strategic action in the face of intimidation. Every photograph, every time-stamped video, every carefully worded email had contributed to turning the tide. It became clear that preparation and evidence were more powerful than fear or anger alone. Perhaps the most lasting impact was the broader lesson for the neighborhood and anyone who might encounter similar struggles. The conflict revealed that systems designed to enforce order, rules, committees, boards, can be manipulated by individuals seeking power, and that community complicity or apathy can amplify the problem. Conversely, it also demonstrated that accountability is possible, that a combination of diligence, courage, and transparency can restore balance even in the most absurdly stacked circumstances.
Watching neighbors slowly reclaim respect for fairness and reconsider their own passive roles was as satisfying as seeing justice served in my own case. The incident also sparked dialogue within the HOA itself. Meetings began to include discussions about reforming enforcement practices, clarifying ambiguous rules, and creating safeguards against personal vendettas being disguised as rule enforcement. While bureaucratic change is often slow, the ripple effect of a public confrontation had forced a reckoning that would prevent similar abuses in the future. It was a reminder that standing up for oneself doesn't just resolve a personal conflict. It can inspire systemic change, protecting others who might otherwise endure harassment silently. Emotionally, the resolution provided a profound sense of closure. Weeks of anxiety, frustration, and helplessness gave way to relief and empowerment. The garden, once tended under a cloud of fear, now felt alive with possibility. The front gate, the driveway, the house itself, all spaces that had felt threatened, were now symbols of reclaimed autonomy. Even casual interactions with neighbors carried a subtle shift. Respect, rather than fear or complacency, began to define relationships. It was a quiet victory, yet a powerful one, underscored by the knowledge that vigilance and persistence had transformed an oppressive situation into an opportunity for restoration. Yet the experience left me reflecting on deeper truths. How often do we, in communities or workplaces, allow authority to go unchallenged, simply because it is cloaked in rules and procedures? How often do we permit small abuses of power to accumulate until they feel insurmountable? And perhaps most importantly, how prepared are we to defend our rights when systems meant to protect us are misused? The answers are not easy, but living through this ordeal had crystallized one undeniable truth. Courage, clarity, and meticulous preparation are essential weapons in any struggle against unjust authority. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood continued to evolve. The once overbearing neighbor kept a low profile, her attempts to assert control curtailed by both formal warnings and the community's heightened awareness. The HOA, chastened by public exposure, implemented more transparent processes for rule enforcement, requiring documentation and evidence for any complaint before action could be taken. Neighbors shared stories of past grievances, sparking ongoing conversations about fairness, respect, and accountability. The culture shifted subtly but significantly toward a community that valued both rules and reason, structure and humanity. On a personal note, I discovered an unexpected benefit, a newfound sense of empowerment. I had faced fear, harassment, and systemic absurdity and emerged not just unbroken, but strategically and emotionally stronger. The experience reshaped my relationship with my home, my neighbors, and myself. No longer would I feel passive in the face of intimidation, nor would I underestimate the power of meticulous preparation and unwavering resolve. Each moment of tension, each fine, each confrontation had contributed to a deeper understanding of resilience, justice, and personal agency. In the end,